A few weeks ago, an election took place in Germany. 4 of the biggest political parties put forward a candidate for the position of the Chancellor, which in Germany is the most influential political office, comparable to a president or prime minister, for example. So, my friends and I were talking about the election, and we came up with a thought experiment. We imagined that someone had told us 4 years ago that in 2025, one of the chancellor candidates would be a lesbian woman married or partnered with a woman of color. And without knowing more about the situation, would we have wanted her to win? I think we would have all said yes in that scenario. Well, if you know about current German politics, you're probably already shaking your head right now, and if you don't, let me hit you with the harsh reality. This woman, Alice Weidel, is the leader of the far-right party AfD, consisting of Islamophobic, sexist, queerphobic politicians, and generally very bad vibes. The underlying question or issue with this is one of identity. How is it even possible that in our thought experiment we would have been so sure that this person would make a great chancellor, just because of some aspects about her gender, her sexual orientation? Apparently, we really cannot deduce anything from these, at least in this extreme case. But of course, it's also not like they don't matter. How can we make sense of this? Today, I want to take a look at 3 different concepts and how they interplay, with the goal of coming a bit closer to an understanding of issues like colorism, patriarchy, and classism, but also group identity, emancipation, and equality. These 3 concepts are intersectionality, standpoint theory, and identity politics. I also talked about intersectionality in my video about the history of feminism, so if you're interested in a more detailed analysis of the historical background, you can check that out. To give you a brief overview, intersectionality and standpoint theory both arose within the context of feminism and critical race theory in the 70s. The 70s are part of what is called the second wave of feminism and the beginnings of post-colonial theory. But I will go into more detail as I get to each individual concept. So let's start with a deeper examination of intersectionality. Within the context of the feminist movement in the 70s, something became really evident to women of color activists. The movement was all about the living reality of white middle-class women. The claims made by the movement, the books written by scholars and activists, but also the gatherings of feminists were overwhelmingly dominated by the experiences of white women. So imagine you're a black feminist at that time, like Audre Lorde was, for example. When entering a feminist space, she was often in the minority of women of color there, and the white women would act as if their discrimination due to being female was the same as the one of a black woman. So she felt misunderstood. She realized that there is no awareness for the struggle of racial discrimination in that place. But when entering an anti-racist space, she experienced sexism and misogyny. This is something she describes in her autobiographical work, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. But it is also something I read and heard women and feminists of color say today in interviews or scholarly work. It is not something of the past at all. The same happens in queer spaces as well, with white people neglecting the complex ways in which queer people of color are discriminated against, which is fundamentally different from the experience of white ones. So, within this context of the feminist movement, women of color, together with activists and scholars of critical race theory, developed the roots of intersectional theory. Because they noticed something. It wasn't like their experience as women of color was just the discrimination of being a woman added onto the discrimination of not being white. It was instead a completely different, specific way in which they were being discriminated against. While Asian men might face certain kinds of stereotypes, Asian women experienced completely different ones. They noticed that even though the anti-racism and the feminist movement achieved a lot of legal changes, these new laws did not take into consideration the complexity of discrimination. As Crenshaw describes in her work on intersectionality, the laws considered all black people male and all female people white. And again, you can still see this today. When media are trying to be representative and feminist, they choose white, able-bodied women that fulfill Western beauty standards. And when they're trying to include perspectives of the global south or economically disadvantaged people, they show the perspectives of men. Therefore, a new term was coined by Crenshaw and other scholars and activists that describes the multiple axes along which people can experience discrimination: race, gender, age, ability, orientation or religious beliefs are some of them. Nowadays, anti-wokeism has made some people argue that the claims made by these theories are only forwarded by white privileged students as a way to undermine and dismiss the criticisms made. And while it is of course valid to look at privilege within the woke bubble and activism, I think it's important to remember that intersectionality was brought up predominantly by women of color that made the experiences I described above in the example of Lorde. Also, when the feminist movement later adapted these concepts, some people described it as a new idea original to the third wave of feminism, while in reality it was second wave women of color who came up with it. So, intersectionality fights the idea that discrimination can be summed up or that all forms of oppression are the same. Instead, women of color or queer, disabled men, or other examples of such sort experience entirely new and different forms of discrimination that cannot be described by the same schemes as the ones of white women or able-bodied queer people, for example. The complexity of this discrimination is descriptive at first, but since the concept came up within an activist setting, it is clearly also to be understood normatively. So if we want to be inclusive in any way, it has to be holistic and not just on one axis like gender. Otherwise, we permit discrimination to continue, just as it did and does within settings that are one-sided. Feminists can be racist AF and anti-racist can be misogynistic. And pretty much everyone is ableist in a world where disabled people are structurally excluded from everyday life. So if we move into this more application-based area, we need to talk about the second concept for today, standpoint theory. For this part, let's start with an example that discusses the issue of ableism. Let's say you were always healthy and fit and could walk around your city normally, go to work or class or wherever you're going, and not really think about it. But then you injure your foot and have to use crutches for some weeks. Suddenly, you realize that you have to take the stairs to get to your office because there's no elevator. You have to take a big step to get on the bus in the morning. You have to stand waiting for the train because there are no benches. Because this wasn't an issue for you before, you didn't even notice it. But now you see the world with completely different eyes because of all these situations that are challenging for you now. This is exactly what standpoint theory describes, but applied to way more things. People who experience any sort of discrimination see the world with different eyes. They notice things others do not even notice because the world works fine for them. Therefore, discriminated groups can have an epistemic advantage or privilege. So saying that someone that is oppressed has privilege is very weird, so let's take a look at what it actually means. It means that because of their oppression, certain groups of people face everyday challenges that can lead to them having a more holistic and truthful understanding of the world, theoretically. The example from the beginning can show this. If you asked an able-bodied person to describe the infrastructure in their city, they probably wouldn't have a lot to say because they don't pay attention to that. A person in a wheelchair, however, might be able to give you a detailed description of the roads, which ones have curbstones and which ones don't, the buildings and the stairs or elevators. So, epistemically, they would be closer to an accurate description of the city. The same goes for racism, for example. A white person would not even know how differently the police acts around people of color because they never experienced that situation. A black man, for example, would be epistemically better off at describing this behavior because he can see how the police acts differently around him. In standpoint theory, the vision oppressed people can acquire of the world is called double consciousness. They can have access to both worlds because, especially if they're a minority, they can observe the differences in behavior around them. Those who are not oppressed, however, do not even notice these things, also because structurally, they are very often not surrounded by members of oppressed groups. However, it is important to keep in mind what I said at the beginning. The epistemic advantage is acquirable by members of oppressed groups, but it is not automatic. It's not like every woman can describe her experience with cism eloquently and easily. One of the reasons for that is that in situations where people are alone, discrimination can be interpreted as a personal attack. If you're not given the language to say, this was racist, this was ageist, for example, you might just think that person didn't like me, or worse, I did something wrong. That's why it is so important to give things a word and give people a language. For example, before the description of sexual harassment became more accessible, harassment already existed, of course, but the victims often did not have the tools to describe what had happened to them. Standpoint theory is the description of the epistemic access that oppressed people have to a more realistic understanding of the world. So as long as people are not represented politically and in public life, their living conditions won't change, not just because others do not care, but also because they really genuinely do not know about these things. If you put together a panel of 10 white middle-class men to govern an imaginary country, and do not include any other groups of people, you would end up with a state that gives a F about the specific needs of women, disabled people, religious minorities, etc. So connected to intersectionality, that leaves us with a claim for representation and exchange. Because, and this is my deep belief, it is possible to raise awareness even among those who are not affected personally by a situation. And I don't think that each group should be left to their own fight. Because, as I said, it's not like every woman is born a feminist because of their epistemic advantage. In fact, there can be very racist people of color and very misogynistic women. Just think of Alice Weidel, the politician I talked about in the beginning. It's just that we need to listen to the experience of people closely and also help each other to find ways of expressing them. But that can also go wrong. So let's talk about identity politics. So far, this all sounded rather positive. Not the discrimination, of course, but the claims and concept used to fight it, right? So why is identity politics such a negative buzzword? What is it even supposed to describe? The accusation to be practicing identity politics is difficult to understand since it comes from many different sides and many different perspectives. It can even be dangerous if it is used as an excuse to continue just as before and not change anything in the area of representation, for example. However, the very valid claim that the critics make is the following. If we start to connect singular standpoints of experience with the reality of oppression of groups, we end up with the same logic that fostered racism and sexism in the first place: separation. Arguing that someone has a completely different vision of the world because of the color of their skin can also very easily be understood as fundamentalist and, in a way, racist. Again, we are separated. Again, we are told what our identity is supposed to be like because of a bodily fact of ourselves. Now, if this criticism comes from a conservative right-winger, I would be very careful. Because what is it supposed to mean in the context of representation? Let's take the example of movie dubbing. In the recent years, it was a concern of many people to only make a black person dub a black actor, for example, or making an Asian translator translate a book written by an Asian author. I think it can be very valid to critically examine this in many situations, especially if it's not even the wish of the author or the actor. Or in the example of translating a historical book, it is of course wrong to assume that just because someone is ethnically Asian, they would automatically know more about the history of Malaysia than someone who might be white but have lived there for 10 years and studied Malaysian history. So technically, the argument is valid and good, but the problem is that more often than not, the white person would get the job not because they're better informed, but just because they're white. So if this criticism is not put into context, it will just lead to a continuation of present-day discrimination. Because history has shown that most people are not really able to look beyond their standpoint if the oppressed groups are not given the voice to share their experiences to them. Anyway, that is the claim of the term identity politics, that woke or feminist or anti-racist groups fall into the same logic of separation that they try to overcome. Now I want to take a deeper look at this on a theoretical level. The underlying problem that the identity politics claim uncovered was the connecting of the identity of a person to the experiences of oppression that they have. And in many ways, I think this is a very important point to raise, because all this time when talking about intersectionality and standpoint theory, we were talking about experiences, structural oppression, moments of exclusion, etc., that can be lived by individuals and by groups. However, it is a whole other step to claim that this makes up their identity. And I know that there are also some people that dislike wokeism because of this, even though they are part of an oppressed group. Some people do not want to get the feeling that their blackness or femaleness makes up their entire personality and identity. An especially important field to look at in this context is queer theory. In many of the other cases we were discussing, the oppression experience is due to a visible fact of a person's body, their gender or their age or their disability, for example. Actually, I've been saying gender this whole episode, even though I'm actually mostly referring to sex, but I have so many words that I need to bleep in this episode that I wanted to have one less. But yeah, I just wanted to say that I do know the difference, and I think it's important to acknowledge this, but yeah, that was the reasoning behind this. Also, this oppression is involuntary. What defines the group women is their oppression that they cannot change. Queer theory, however, brought up many new perspectives on this that challenged this notion and raised a very important problem. What makes up the group identity of an oppressed group? Because in the end, this stays within the binary of oppression. So, for example, my identity is either being a woman and being part of that oppressed group, or being a man and not being part of an oppressed group in this case. But within queer theory, there are voices that claim that this is part of the problem and that only the complete refusal of identification with these categories can be a way out. If we define our identity as a gay person with our discrimination, would we not have any gay identity anymore if we didn't experience societal rejection? Another point to keep in mind is that very often we perceive people within their context. Discriminatory experiences can happen to people as individuals, like the example I talked about before, where you can feel that it is just a personal attack. But in many everyday life situations, people are found within groups. So a black person within a white friend group might be treated differently by the police. Proximity to power explains this situation, and also helps us better understand people like Alice Weidel or people who vote for right-wing parties even though they're immigrants themselves. I mean, understand as a phenomenon, not understand in the sense of agreeing with them. The closer you can get to the norm of the white, middle-class, able-bodied man that structurally holds more power in society, the less oppressed you might think you are. Also, I want to discuss another criticism. Focusing the discussion on gender, race, etc. moves the focus away from class, which is another axis that heavily influences all of this. Some scholars even see the whole racist and patriarchal system as an expression of capitalist logic of appropriation of labor. They argue that it is not actually racism that plays the crucial role here, but the delegation of labor to oppressed groups that could have just as well been a different group of people. Personally, I do not agree with this idea and think that colorism and misogyny go way beyond economic appropriation and are deeply rooted into the value systems of our society. Still, it is important to keep in mind that the experiences of a rich person of color can be fundamentally different from the ones of a poor one. The same goes for women or disabled people as well in some ways, which can be seen in the movie The Untouchables. I also mentioned this in the video about the history of feminism, since the critique towards the first and second wave is not just one of race, but also of class. While the movement was very focused on the problems of stay-at-home mothers and their fight for the ability to pursue a career, the reality of many women of color and women of lower classes was that they were already working and doing the domestic unpaid labor as well. So we have to keep in mind that class and economic status heavily affect experiences of discrimination as well. Karin Stöckner suggests a dialectical approach to identity as a provisional alternative. Identity as the tension between identification with groups and possible oppression, and the complete refusal of all categorization. It has to be both. Either one of the extremes just leads to an unrealistic or false understanding of the world. Fully connecting identity to group membership makes it very hard to explain a person like Alice Weidel, for example, who clearly does not identify as a queer woman. She even specifically said so herself. It also doesn't explain the possible experiences or identities of interracially adopted kids or transgender people. Fully seeing identity as loose and arbitrary, however, also undermines the experiences of discrimination that are very real. So we can try to embrace a dialectical approach. Identity as the tension between identity and non-identity. To continue this logic with the famous ideas of Simone de Beauvoir in her Ethics of Ambiguity, we are the tension between being an individual and being part of a group, being free and being unfree, being the subject and being the object, being and not being. Before I end this video, I wanted to say that I got my first supporters on Ko-fi to send me something for this channel. It's a website where you can send one-time or monthly payments to content creators. And I'm just so thankful for that. I really want to continuously improve the quality of this video and keep working on this project. And getting this kind of support really helps me a lot. And if you want to support this channel but do not have the financial means, which I totally understand, it also helps if you just comment something, can be anything really, and or share the videos that you like with people that you like. Or if you hate the videos, you can share them with people that you don't like. That's also a win-win situation for all of us. So yeah, just a huge thanks to my Ko-fi supporters. Thank you so much. And thanks for watching. Bye bye.